عن حركانخ ميريمات نسوبيتي وسر مع رع ست بن رع صارع رعمسو ميري إيمن ميري راحر أختي نترعا ميري إيمن نسو نترو. Every year, on both the 22nd of October and February, the famous Abu Simbel sun phenomenon takes place. The rays of the morning sun go inside the temple, and gradually light becomes a friend of the sea, until it reaches the most sacred place of the temple, the Holy of the Holiest. Inside, the four statues of the greatest gods of Egypt, with Ramses the Great. The sun illuminates the statues, starting with Ramses, and as minutes go by, the golden rays embraces God Amen, then God Ra or Akhti, and finally a small part of the statue of God Ptah. It takes up to 25 minutes, then the rays retreat and the shrine falls into darkness, waiting for the phenomenon to occur again on the exact dates and times. An absolute miracle that was orchestrated by the ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago. I am Mohie and this is Egyptology. Today's story is about the Abu Simbel solar alignment phenomenon. Winin Pet, Winin Minui Tipta. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, was one of the greatest kings of the ancient world, and the one dubbed by the ancient Egyptians the Great Son of Egypt and Ramses the Greatest. A great warrior and a master builder who became a role model for kings after him. Once ascended the throne, Ramses started major projects, including building and completing major temples all across the country, with additions to both Luxor and Karnak temples. But his most extensive work was done at Lower Nubia, where Ramses built 7 temples extending from modern Aswan to Wadi Halfa, and they were Beit el-Wali, Garf Hussein, Wadi Sibuh, Dir, Aksha, and the 2 famous temples of Abu Simbel. These temples were Ramses's way of showing his power and dominance over these regions. And for 1,000 years after Ramses, no Egyptian king built a temple at Nubia. At Abu Simbel, the story began with choosing a location with a unique religious significance in the ancient Egyptian religion. The area had 2 mountains, one called Miha, associated with god Horus, the other called Epshik, associated with the goddess Hathor, who had the title Lady of Epshik. By the 15th year of Ramses's reign, the construction work started at Abu Simbel, and the plan was to carve 2 temples into the bedrock. The largest was called the Temple of Ramses, beloved of Amun, dedicated to god Ra or Akhti and Ramses himself, and the small temple to be dedicated to goddess Hathor was Queen Nefertari, the great royal wife of Ramses and the love of his life. The Abu Simbel temples were uniquely designed so Ramses could send several messages decoded within the temple's structure and inscriptions. At the entrance, we find 22 baboons, which indicates the 24 hours of the day, as the ancient Egyptians divided the day into 22 hours, with 2 additional hours for sunrise and sunset. Underneath these baboons, we find Ramses's title, and then his 4 sitting statues. These statues were the manifestations of Ramses with the Egyptian gods. Each statue had a name, and the names of these statues are Miri Atem, beloved of god Atem, Miri Amun, beloved of god Amun, Hekatawi, ruler of the 2 lands, Ra-en Hekawu, son of rulers. Ramses's biggest decoded message was at the entrance, as we find a standing statue of god Ra or Akhti holding 2 symbols. Wisr means power and Ma'at means universal order. And this part can be read in ancient Egyptian language as Wisr Ma'at Ra, which is the coronation name of Ramses. Inside the temple, we find statues of Ramses depicted as Osiris, the Egyptian god of the netherworld and the judge of the dead. On the walls behind the statues, scenes and inscriptions tell the story of the famous battle of Kadesh, which Ramses fought against the Hittites. And now let's move to the most important part of the temple, the Holy of the Holiest. It contains 4 statues of gods Ra-Hor-Akhti, Ramses II, Amun, and Ptah. The 3 main gods of Egypt, with Ramses who placed himself among them. Inside this part of the temple, the unique sun alignment phenomenon takes place twice a year, which I will explain in details later in this video. Another message that was sent by Ramses was the total number of the temple statues. They were 16, 4 at the entrance, 8 inside the first court, and another 4 at the Holy of the Holiest. And the number 16 was the perfect number for the Nile flood level in ancient Egypt. To the north of Abu Simbel, we find a small temple dedicated to Hathor and Nefertari. He has made a temple by excavation in the mountain of eternal work in Nubia, which the king of South and North Egypt, Wisr Ma'at Ra Setep en Ra, Ramses, has made for the great royal wife Nefertari, beloved of Mut, in Nubia like Ra forever and ever. This temple was built with love. Everything refers to the unique status of Nefertari and Ramses' love for her. At the entrance, we find this unique phrase, Irin F, Menu, Awu Wiru, in Hemet Wirit, Nefertari, Mirit Mut, Weben Ra, NS. Not only that, but Ramses went for more to demonstrate his love inside the temple. And yes, scenes of Ramses exist, but Nefertari had major reliefs honoring her. Especially the relief of Nefertari being crowned by the goddess Isis, the Great of Magic, and goddess Hathor, Lady of Epshik. This coronation scene was exclusive for kings in ancient Egypt. By the year 31st of Ramses' reign, the temples of Abu Simbel were completed, but by this time, Nefertari had already left our world. Moments of sadness struck Ramses in his 22nd and 24th years of reign. First, his mother died, and then she was followed by Nefertari. Nefertari made her last appearance in Ramses' monuments in the year 24, as she was shown at the opening festivals, or what seems to be the opening festivals of Abu Simbel. Her health was deteriorating, and maybe she witnessed the scene far away on a boat. Ramses' love story with Nefertari didn't end there. He elevated their eldest daughter, Merit Amun, to become the honorary queen after her mother, and Merit Amun replaced Nefertari in later added scenes at Abu Simbel. The last gift of Ramses to Nefertari was her tomb at the Valley of the Queens, which is known today as QV 66. Besides the fact that this tomb is one of the most beautiful tombs to be constructed in Egyptian history, it was the only monument that Ramses constructed that doesn't have a depiction of himself. Not even one relief for Ramses, they are all for Nefertari. In the winter of 1873-1874, the famous writer Amelia Edwards arrived at Abu Simbel, and she was the first to notice and document the solar alignment phenomenon. Edwards documented the phenomenon in her book 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, which was published in 1877. After this book, the sun festivals at Abu Simbel took place twice a year in the area. With the discovery of Amelia Edwards, so many questions were raised. How the ancient Egyptians mastered such a phenomenon, and why on specific days? These questions baffled everyone for years, including scholars and writers. For example, one common explanation was that the phenomenon dates were Ramses' birthday and coronation. Some said it was the date he was deified into a god. All of these explanations have one thing in common: they are all completely unrealistic. For instance, we don't have records for birthdays in ancient Egypt, so we can never know Ramses' birthday, besides the fact that Ramses was crowned in June. The most acceptable explanation, at least from my own point of view, was depending on the fact that the ancient Egyptians divided the year into 3 seasons. Akhit, inundation or flood, from September to January. Pirit, emergence or winter, January to May. And Shimu, low water or harvest or summer, from May to September. The phenomenon takes place on October 21st, which was probably the start of winter, and also on February 21st, the beginning of the harvest season. In other words, the start and the end of the agricultural cycle. But one question remains. In modern times, the phenomenon takes place on the 22nd of October and February, with one day in difference. How did that happen? Well, the story of Abu Simbel still missing some chapters. It started in the early 1950s as Egypt faced a problem that might lead to the demise of Abu Simbel.